Okay, so I think we can start opening our cameras, those that want to open their cameras, and we will be starting in a few minutes, actually a couple of minutes, not more, not really a few minutes. Leon, thank you very much for being with us. I can now see you. It's great to have you with us as well. I already greeted Giulia. And people are, the way we pronounce your name is Bennun?
Bennun.
Bennun, okay, thank you. Sorry, I was not aware of that.
No problem.
I'm just taking 1 or 2 minutes to have some of the members of the discussion group, because they're still joining in for our meeting. Καλησπέρα όλοι. Okay, I think we should get started. Just at the turn of 3 o'clock Athens time, 2 o'clock Switzerland time, and Leon, I suppose that's 1 o'clock if you are in the UK, where your headquarters are. So as we had announced, all of this meeting will be taking place in English. So because we have two exquisite and we're really proud to have the 2 speakers that we have today who will be doing the presentation in English, and the ensuing discussion will also take place in English. I'm very, very happy that we're having this meeting today. And what will follow is, after the presentation, we will have the time to discuss. So without further ado, I will just say that today we're having a presentation by IUCN and the Biodiversity Consultancy on the study that they have published under the title Mitigating Biodiversity Impacts Associated with Solar and Wind Energy Development. It is a great pleasure for us to be working on today's event with you, with both of you, Giulia and Leon, and thank you very much for honoring us. I will not say very much now, because what I want to do now is to invite the director of the entire organization of the European Public Law Organization, Professor Spiros Flogaitis, who is also sharing our enthusiasm, and I think he is very keen to welcome you in person and to welcome this collaboration with IUCN. So, Professor Flogaitis, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, dear Spiros. I am very happy to be with you all today. And actually, I'm very happy with the work we are all very happy with the work we are doing. Perhaps you don't know that the first job I had in my life after my studies was in the area of the environment. And I keep this memory very strong. Dear friends and colleagues, we are very pleased that the Institute for Sustainable Development of the European Public Law Organization is organizing, in collaboration with Convergences-Greece and with funding from the Green Fund, Prasino Tamio in Greek, today's event. This event is part of a project. The project is entitled Development of Renewable Energy Sources while Ensuring the Environment and Social Consensus and Conservation of the Natura 2000 network. And we're doing this on the celebration of the Earth Day. The European Public Law Organization, an international organization with permanent observer status to the UN General Assembly, that I have the honor to serve as its director, has a track record of participating in environment projects. The Institute of Sustainable Development has also a long history of working with globally recognized institutions and bringing together stakeholders through dialogues on the sustainability challenges of our times. Since its first online discussion at the very start of the pandemic last March. It has partnered with distinguished interlocutors such as the Delphi Economic Forum, CEPS in Brussels, and Convergences-Greece of the World Human Forum, a reliable partner for this Green Fund project headed by Mrs. Alexandra Mitsotakis. This particular project brings together representatives of more than 20 entities, government agencies, NGOs, and representatives of investors of renewable energy sources who are involved in the design, licensing, and operation of renewable energy facilities in Greece. We welcome you again, and we thank you for your contribution to this dialogue. We are delighted that today, as part of this project and dialogue, our Institution for Sustainable Development has secured the participation of two highly distinguished institutions: the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, based in Switzerland, and the Biodiversity Consultancy, based in Cambridge. We are keenly looking forward to continue this collaboration in the long term. And indeed, I'm very happy to know that the EPLO's Institute and the IUCN have already agreed to publish the very significant study that will be presented today in Greek. I would like to welcome very warmly our two distinguished speakers today, Mrs. Giulia Carbone from IUCN and Mr. Leon Bennun from the Biodiversity Consultancy. I hope you enjoy the presentation and discussion, and I look forward to welcoming you and hosting you physically in one of our premises in Athens soon, and would now like to ask Mr. or Minister Spyros Kouvelis, Director of the Institute for Sustainable Development, to introduce today's presentation and event details. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Floraitis, and thank you for this warm welcome to our today's presenters. And yes, I used to be, as I often say, I used to be a minister, but now I'm okay. So, you know, I will keep on doing this with my hat as director of the Institute for Sustainable Development. And I want to echo what Professor Floraitis said, that it's a particular pleasure today to be organizing this on the Earth Day. My personal history brings me back to long ties with IUCN, so also for personal reasons, I'm very happy to be having this event today with you. And also, I'm very happy because today we're doing this in the aftermath of yesterday's agreement about the climate law in the European Union, which is also a benchmark that I think we should be keeping with very good memories in our mind, and hopefully as a basis for further work. In today's presentation, I have to tell you that we have a very high level of participation. We have more than 150 people that registered for this event, which for Greece is a really big number, especially if you take into account that at the same time, the European Union is presenting today the Bauhaus, a new Bauhaus initiative. And actually, this is why our co-organizer, Ms. Alexandra Mitsotakis, cannot be with us because she's speaking at that event, and makes us very proud, of course. And also, we're very happy because your study is coming at a point that our discussion group has been debating on for about a year now, and it can be a very polarized debate at some times. And what we have already and always strive to make sure is that our discussion will be based on knowledge, scientific knowledge, real data, real knowledge, and so it will be based on proper exchange so that we can come to a common denominator of what should be accepted so that renewable energy can be developed without the cost on nature. So let me just say one thing or two things about your institutions and you. IUCN is a membership union uniquely composed of both government and civil society organizations. It provides public, private, and non-governmental organizations with the knowledge and tools that enable human progress, economic development, and nature conservation to take place together. IUCN was created in 1948, and it is now the world's largest and most diverse environmental network, harnessing the knowledge, resources, and reach of more than 1,400 member organizations and some 15,000 experts. So it is an amazing knowledge base, and that justifies my and all of our happiness to be working with you today. IUCN is represented today by Giulia Carbone, who is the Deputy Director of the Global Business and Biodiversity Program and has led the project focusing on solar and wind energy and biodiversity. The second institution that is today with us is the Biodiversity Consultancy. It works with business, finance, and governments to integrate biodiversity in economic development and decision-making. The Biodiversity Consultancy is represented today by Leon Bennun, if I pronounce it right this time. And Leon is the Biodiversity Consultancy's chief scientist and lead author of the IUCN and the Biodiversity Consultancy guidelines for mitigating biodiversity impacts associated with solar and wind energy. Leon is a tropical ecologist by training whose work focuses on using science to improve policy and practice. So very much the kind of person we need in our discussion, I think. I will not say much about the study itself because the plan is that now Giulia and Leon will take the floor and they will deliver a presentation. You can take as much time as you want. I'm sure that both the members of our discussion group and the public that is following our discussion online will be very interested to hear what you will be presenting. And once you're finished, I will open the floor for discussion. Let me just clarify that in the discussion that will follow, the members of our discussion group can jump in and ask you directly a question, but also the people that are attending this meeting can use the Q&A facility that Zoom provides us with, and you can write your questions in writing there, and both the speakers and all of us will be able to see them online as you're writing them. So I think it's Giulia who's starting first. Okay, so Giulia, you have the floor and you can share your screen. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Professor Frogaitis, and thank you very much, Spiros, for the invitation. It's a real honor to be here, and especially because, you know, in the context of a real intervention, this is your project, which I think is really an incredible, is also very interesting for me to learn more about your project, because I think it could be a really interesting example for other countries and other situations, because you know very well, you're not the only one facing these challenges. So I'll share my screen now. The plan is that we are presenting, Leon and I and others have worked together on these guidelines, but the way we are splitting is that I give a general presentation on the guidelines, and then on the enabling environment context, so the policy aspects of it. And then Leon will dive more more specifically into the mitigation measures that we have identified and the whole idea of the mitigation hierarchy. So that kind of context for the developers. And then, of course, we take questions depending on which questions we'll split. So sharing my screen now, and this is where I need to, okay. Sorry. Okay, and all right. So I just want to, okay, put some faces. All right. Okay, so let me start with the cover of our guidelines. I think the main point I want to make about this is that it's a collaborative approach, and it wasn't just the IUCN going its own and say we developed this alone, but it was really developed with business and 4 members of IUCN that we picked basically based on their expertise in the topic, or their kind of previous works, you will recognize BirdLife International in this list. And we all know that the great work they have done in the past and currently on the whole questions about especially wind and avifauna. So the idea was to do this in a collaborative way. So it's an IUCN publication and TBC. So the last, the production, the final saying is with IUCN. However, we really followed, the process of consultation, listening to what the companies had to say, their ideas, their best practice. And then in addition to having input from these three companies, we went through a very long process of getting feedback also from other companies and industry associations. Of course, it's never, complete. We could have done better. I'm sure it's too bad that we didn't really know about your project. Otherwise, we would have reached out. But we collected, a lot of input, a lot of detailed input from a lot of organizations, which I think made the guidelines a much better product. Another important element is that the foreword is signed by all partners. And this also was a very constructive process of bringing together the vision, the key messages from the companies and the NGOs together. And the key point that is highlighted in the foreword, but is really the spirit that we have, is kind of underlines the entire guidelines, is that we need more renewable energy. And that's not at all on the up for discussion. We know the numbers, it's especially for energy for electricity, renewable energy for electricity has a nice big substantive share. But certainly for the total energy consumption, renewable, is around 10%. So we definitely need more. And therefore, we think these guidelines are really timely, because we need to make sure that we address potential obstacles even before they become real and they actually stop the process. So it's really important that this message goes out, that there are challenges, but we know how to address them and there are opportunities for addressing them. And this is really the message that you will find in the foreword that really brought together both the companies and the NGOs, saying that we need, these two crises, climate change crisis and biodiversity crisis, they can be addressed, and one shouldn't, create more problems for the other. So, as I said, the beginning is the recognition that wind and solar, and so in this case, note that this document really focuses on three technologies, so offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar. And we did this on purpose to be specific, technology specific, and not a generic publication on renewable energy, because we wanted to give enough advice to project developers to be able to, so that they're actionable right then and there, and they don't have to go and look for additional, implementation recommendations. So we decided to focus on these three technologies, understanding that there are other technologies that are becoming more and more important, but these three are really the ones that right now are the, really the massive, where the massive investments are taking place. So looking at these and, recognizing that some interesting research has been done recently to look at how much the current or projected developments in wind and solar could impact biodiversity, and biodiversity represented by proxy by key biodiversity areas or protected areas. And these are some of the numbers that have been identified in these papers, shows that actually it is important that we take action, that we look into the unintended consequence on biodiversity sooner rather than later. So there is the reference to these papers, which are, I'm sure you know them, and they're global. But it is a good starting point to actually make the case that it is important, and it's not just because we are talking about renewable sources, we are good to go, and the green light is there independently of how these technologies are implemented. So in terms of impacts, we have, the way we have structured the guidelines is by technology. So we're having solar, actually solar is one chapter, but we're looking at photovoltaic and the concentrated together. Then we have offshore wind and separately onshore wind. What we do there is first we start from the impact and looking at how in the different ways, direct and indirect, these technologies, these projects can actually impact on biodiversity. And then you will see that, we are looking at different dimensions. We are looking at, especially when we are looking at wind, we have the airspace, but we also have the land space, the landscape, or the seascape. And this is, I think, one of the key challenge from the renewable energy perspective, that we have to look at multi-dimension. So it's not just one dimension as land or air. It's really about keeping an eye on the different aspects of it. So of course there are all the impacts that have been studied in the collision directly to, into the infrastructure or into the transmission lines. But there is a lot of impacts that are associated with the footprint of this infrastructure, especially when we are talking about utility scale. And so starting from an overview of these impacts, then the guidelines go into providing recommendations along the mitigation hierarchy. But I would let Leon speak about that. What is the mitigation hierarchy, and what are the potential different measures that a project developer can implement during the life cycle of the project and at the different stages of the mitigation hierarchy. What I like to highlight is the fact that one conclusion that is a conclusion that actually was something that we realized right at the beginning of the conversation between the business and the NGOs when we start working together, is that key in this sector is really early planning. Avoidance of impact, the most effective way. I mean, and this happens to all sectors, but certainly in renewable energy, there is a great opportunity to make this happen. The importance of early planning to support avoidance of impact. As we said, poorly planned development are, the type of impacts is on biodiversity, on ecosystem services, and therefore also indirectly to people, local communities, indigenous peoples, if these activities happen in their lands. And therefore, what is really important is site selection. Site selection was really the key point that was mentioned. One recommendations that these guidelines make in line with IUCN policies, so resolutions or recommendations, is really to avoid citing these projects in protected area or conserved areas. And this is, in line with IUCN resolutions, as I said. There is a very clear description of how, how we see this happening in what kind of sites, and the spirit of this recommendation is really that these sites have been identified for the conservation of biodiversity, and and according to IUCN resolutions, we believe that this activity at the utility scale will have a residual impact in these areas, and therefore it will not be compatible. But what really came up during these conversations was the fact that, yes, of course, no-go areas is an important concept. But let's turn it around and identify go areas. Let's be, constructive. And therefore, this is really the role that policy, public policy should really embrace, identifying what, land or marine space should be more suitable for these developments. And therefore, areas that have low biodiversity value, because they have already been converted, they have already been degraded, and therefore any of these developments will probably not need offsets, might actually enhance biodiversity, because as you know, in a lot of this, energy development, there is the opportunity of enhancement. But of course, this enhancement has a net biodiversity value if it starts from a very low baseline of biodiversity. So let's find these areas that are already degraded where this infrastructure can be implemented. And one way to incentivize this is to say we identify these areas, these go areas, and these go areas could have a really permitting fast track. And therefore also the development becomes much faster. All this can be done through, land use plans, spatial plans, so land use or marine spatial plans, and informed by strategic environmental assessment, which is really the process that assess the impacts or opportunities of policies and programs from an environmental perspective. Another important element in renewable energy we have identified being the cumulative effects. So yes, of course, you can say and this is, for example, IFC performance standards, requires businesses, individuals to assess also the cumulative effects. But we know very well that the best player, the best actor to look into it, assess and address cumulative effects is really the government at the local and national levels that has the overview of all the area and all the different actors, because it's not just about in the same sector, but multiple sector and how different impacts interact to each other, and identifying what are the key biodiversity values that become your reference point in assessing the cumulative impact. So again, another really important role for the government to play. So land use planning, so land use or marine spatial planning, cumulative impact assessment. Now, there are situations where these this land use or marine spatial plans are not available or not done in the proper way, or they haven't done with the renewable energy in mind as one of the users, or they haven't really prioritized biodiversity. And one of the recommendations we make, consider that our guidelines are for project developers. We give them the context of policy because that's where they operate, but the recommendations are really for project developers. So one recommendation we make is, apart from trying to operate in areas where the land use and marine spatial plans are available and they provide a good context, but also the alternative is also work on sensitivity mapping. So these are processes where different stakeholders can identify the presence, absence of biodiversity features and identify the sensitivities of these features to the specific activity. So in this case, renewable energy. So sensitivity maps focus on birds, but they can also focus on other type of impacts, such as footprint type of impact, so they're identifying areas that could be more or less sensitive to the development. I will ask, actually, Leon will give you an example from Kenya, where he actually worked on that, where they have developed a sensitivity mapping for the wind power in Kenya. And I put the case study because we have an example. The example is in the guidelines, but I have also put two websites that are really interesting. One is BirdLife, because they have done a specific sensitivity mapping tool for the Mediterranean, Middle East, and North Africa. And they're also working on the same tool for India. And then there is a very recent publication developed by BirdLife, but also for Europe, that looking at how to develop sensitivity maps. And again, provides a lot of interesting recommendations on how to structure this process, which gives you also an output, a tool like a map. Again, this is a complementary and supports land use plans, which, however, have a very strong policy element, which is not to be, it cannot be replaced effectively by anything else. So this is, in a way, what we have put in the guidelines, also to clarify to the users of the guidelines how the different things come together. The role of the project developers, so you will see the blue, project focus, mitigation, and enhancement. This is really where the developer has full control. Before that, they can have a site selection and risk screening, again, the developer. But before, there is the context, and this is the larger circle where you have the spatial planning and the sensitivity mapping, and the key drivers are governments and NGOs, which set basically the context. And so these players come together, and if they play well together, the site selected will have minimal in biodiversity impact, maximum resources, wind and solar, and output, and therefore really bringing together the climate change and the biodiversity objectives will be addressed at the same time. So here, this is like a simple decision-making tree that we have in our guidelines, saying, from a project developers, how do you operate in this? Have a spatial plan, yes, therefore, follow your path and look into which areas have been preferred, have been identified in the spatial plan. No, and therefore has sensitivity biodiversity features being mapped. So this is the sensitivity mapping I was talking about. Yes, so again, select according to this map. No, therefore facilitate these maps. So basically the message is you need to have this larger context mapped out before you actually, as a project developer, go into your site selection. Because what you want to do is, if you do site selection and site, screening and comparing is great. However, without knowing the bigger context, you might miss out on sites, and also the relative context, how the sites you are looking into compare to others, and therefore this is pretty much the message that we are trying to pass through, this decision-making tree. So yes, this is the same. So basically, to conclude my introduction, the guidelines basically are really the first target audience are developers, so utility developers. We have already, we have done this with 3 companies. We hope to work with more companies in the future. We are gonna, but the idea was really to give a tool to the project developers to understand the mitigation hierarchy and to understand what are the different opportunities and measures. And this, Leon will give you some ideas. From policymakers' perspective, was a indirect way to push, to give a message about the importance that the role they play in setting the context. So this land use and marine spatial plans, how important these are, and also how eventually they can use the guidelines in their permitting, in developing the permitting requirements, and looking at how to read a project, how to assess a project. And for financiers, the same. We hope the guidelines will offer them a better insight on how to identify a good sound project that will minimize impacts, mitigate in full the impacts on biodiversity. So there are a few things in the pipelines. We have guidance for investors on interpreting biodiversity data. So these will be developed for solar, wind, onshore wind and offshore wind. It's really it's not a biodiversity screening, is a tool that we hope can be used as part of the biodiversity screening, but basically will use specific features of the 3 technologies and cross-reference them to known type of sensitivities in terms of what species are sensitive to some aspects of this type of technologies, and therefore guide the reader, the user, sorry, that might be querying different biodiversity data sets to know how to react if a certain species is present or absent. And it will also look into footprint type of impact, so it will identify type of certain features such as protected areas, KBAs, and so on, and highlight how to respond to a presence or absence of these features. We are looking also at delivering 3 technical seminars, 1 per technologies. These will be very specific to, really focusing on for the utility staff, so to be able to understand better the mitigation hierarchy. And we are creating a synthesis report, so shorter than this, I forgot how many, 100 and 200 pages, in English, Chinese, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. And we are also exploring a phase 2 with an expanded group of companies to check, to look into potential continuing this type of engagement with other companies exploring new activities. So that's all for me. This is my email, and of course you're more than welcome to contact me directly. As Pyro said, we have been discussing the translation in Greek of the guidelines, which is excellent. It's such a great, it's a great reward for us having done this work, knowing that it is interesting and other organizations want to take it and translate. So we'll be obviously there at your disposal to support that, if there are any questions on the translation. But on this, I think I'm done with my share. Should we go directly to Leon and then?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yes, I think we will not take any questions now because I think it would be best to have also the full presentation, so with Leon's part as well. One point I wanted to make is that we now have a good number of the members of our group with us, and I just noticed that the actual Secretary General of the Ministry of the Environment and Energy, the Secretary General for Land Planning, for Spatial Planning, has just joined the meeting. So I think you're talking directly, excuse me, Secretary General, to the horse's ear.
Fantastic.
So Leon, please take the floor.
Thanks very much. Let me see if I can share my screen. I hope that's visible now.
Yes, it's good. Please go ahead.
Great. So thanks very much for the opportunity to present today. And I have to say, it's fantastic to see such a multi-stakeholder group assembled. It's really an exciting approach, which could be a model for other countries.
Sorry to interrupt you, Leon. What
Mm-hmm.
we're seeing now on our screen is like a page of a Word document.
Oh, sorry, wrong screen.
Yeah.
Let me stop sharing and see if I can get the right
saw it for a minute
now.
and then it went off.
Let's try again. Thanks for that. Is that better?
Yes, now we can see.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to follow on from Giulia's talk to talk about some of the more nuts and bolts aspects of mitigation. I'm focusing on wind, leaving aside solar, because that I think is the main interest for this group. And just to note that the guidelines are general and global, so they don't just apply to a particular context or region. We've been particularly concerned to make sure that they're useful for the developing parts of the world, where there's a rapid upsurge in development. There's often quite a weak national regulation, and there's often quite poor information base and data. So there's particular challenges in applying the approaches that we're outlining. It's a bit different in a more developed and data-rich part of the world like the EU, but the same principles apply everywhere. So at the center, the heart of the good practice approaches that we're outlining in the guidelines is the mitigation hierarchy, which Giulia already mentioned. I'm sure most people are familiar with. The idea being that you try to deal with your impacts by, first of all, avoiding them, then what you can't avoid, minimizing, after that, restoring, and if necessary, offsetting impacts so that you eventually end up with no net loss or preferably a net gain for biodiversity. It's a hierarchy because you start with the avoidance as being the priority and move through the approach. This is how, diagram from the guidelines, this is how the hierarchy might play out in a project for a wind development. Ideally, you'd first of all start in the place where you can avoid all the impacts. That isn't always possible. You can see this one has avoided quite a few by siting in terms of the overall spatial layout indicating a particular site where the development will take place. You can further avoid impacts by your micro design of the project and how you go about that, where you put the turbines in the landscape at your site. And then you move on to a process of minimizing through actions that you may take in terms of how the wind farm operates, restoring your impacts on site, and then potentially offsetting and even going beyond that to enhance. So that's the general approach over the project timeline. This is very schematic and it will vary from place to place, but the key point being that you should be trying to emphasize avoidance and minimization and having to do as little as possible if you can for restoration and offset. Let's try and get this slide to move forward. So Giulia outlined quite a number of different impacts that could take place from wind projects, and they're all important to consider. But it's also helpful to simplify things a bit and think about two general classes that generally create the most concern or issues to deal with. And one is to do with the footprint, so your actual spatial impact on land or sea, and the other is to do with collisions, something that's particularly specific to wind projects, therefore needs particular attention because it's not always dealt with well in the generalized thinking about the mitigation hierarchy approaches for other kinds of infrastructure. Just to note that for offshore wind, it's a bit more complex. You may also have issues around construction noise, vessel collisions, etc., that need to be dealt with. In terms of footprint, obviously there's the land or the sea take. There can be roads which have various knock-on effects and indirect impacts. The farm may fragment the habitat. There also can be barrier effects and behavioral displacement where species are not using the area as they used to because the wind farm is there. This is an example from the North Sea where the eider duck are avoiding passing through the wind farm. Here, these are the turbines, and you can see that the birds are staying largely outside it. So effectively, this is an area of habitat that the birds used to use, which is now lost to them. There can also be issues with open country birds, grassland birds that don't like tall structures in their living area. So you find that if you put up a large turbine, they tend to move away. And that again can be a behavioral response that causes habitat loss in effect. Many species could be impacted by wind farms, but globally there's a number of groups that are a particular risk. And the vulnerability of these groups to collision especially depends on their particular behavioral characteristics. Some species are just more likely to run into wind turbines or transmission lines, and also their demographics, in other words, their population characteristics and their conservation status. So species that are long-lived and slow breeding and also threatened with extinction are much more at risk at the population level from potential wind farm impacts than other ones. So key species groups that tend to be problematic or of concern include vultures and other large raptors. Vultures are particularly liable to fly into wind turbines because of their behavior and the way that they see the world, with essentially their eyes pointing down, looking for food below rather than ahead of them. Migratory soaring birds, so wind farms that are placed on migration routes, can be problematic. Bustards are a group that's particularly at risk from transmission lines, where they tend to fly into the top wire. They don't see it very well. Bats generally are becoming more of a concern. They're less well known than birds, but as wind farms proliferate around the world, we're seeing some quite unexpected impacts on bats, especially outside Europe and North America. There's not much known about bat behavior and how that may interact with wind turbines. And one unexpected thing is that many bats are attracted to wind turbines during operation, and so can be a particular risk. And then marine mammals are a particular concern in the oceans, especially from the effects of noise and vessel collisions, but also potentially displacement as well. Giulia talked about some of the tools to support avoidance. So if avoidance is the key thing, then the more we can do to make it happen effectively, the better. Upstream planning through strategic land use or marine spatial planning is really ideal. And that would ideally combine not just environmental concerns about sensitive biodiversity and other environmental issues, but also aspects of technical, economic, social considerations. So you're working out the best place to put things from a range of different approaches so that you can try and keep all the constraints in mind at once. And the great advantage of this approach is that you can incorporate development targets. So you can look at how much wind power you want to produce as a share of your energy production generally and where that should be distributed. And also look at cumulative impact limits. So what kind of level of mortality might be a threshold for particular species or species groups. You can take into account the full scale of development across the landscape once you know where things are going. There's a good example here from South Africa, where there's been a strong science-based assessment of where to put wind and solar energy based on these various constraints and based on a good set of information and data as well. Unfortunately, this approach is still rather little practiced around the world. It's often unclear whose responsibility it is. Ideally, it should be government, but government doesn't always take the lead. It can be quite slow and costly because it involves often collecting a lot of new data and involving stakeholders extensively, because you want to make sure that everybody who has a concern or interest or information is involved in the process and happy with the outcome. And that means it can also be quite contentious. When you're dealing with decisions on land use, there can be quite strong conflicting views about what's appropriate and what's a priority. So it can be hard to get the consensus at the end, but still extremely valuable, something that really de-risks development. So that once you have your plan and it's accepted by all the key stakeholders and can be updated with new information as it comes along, you know, a really good basis for deciding where to put your developments, including potentially these go areas that Giulia was talking about. Often you haven't got the option of bringing all that information together. It can still be very useful to map sensitive biodiversity itself. Giulia mentioned this sensitivity mapping example from Kenya, where we worked with a range of other NGOs to look at the risk from wind developments. And this had two components in these two maps here. So one is to do with sites, so what the risk on the ground, others to do with species, essentially corresponding to the collision risk, that there's some blurring of the boundaries. And you can see that the two maps have got some commonalities but aren't identical. So again, you need to consider both of these elements in your planning. A bit more detail on the Kenyan one. This is a different color scheme, but the same general approach. The darker the green, the higher the risk. And you can perhaps see, although it's a bit faint, these pale squares are the economic wind area as mapped in terms of wind intensity, the power you can get out of it. And you can see that there's quite a large overlap of the wind intensity areas with low risk sites, but also with some higher risk sites. And we can see that some of the existing or planned wind farms are in these higher risk areas because this approach wasn't done well enough in advance, so plans have already been made. Again, a good reason for making sure that you do the strategic planning before you start to develop your sector if possible. And just to flag that, again, it's really important to have different stakeholders involved with this. So as well as the NGOs here, this involved a whole range of bat and bird experts and other scientists in Kenya. It was done under the umbrella of the Ministry of Energy, so it involved government, and it also involved the wind sector and other industry and finance representatives through a series of consultative workshops. So that gives the whole thing a much higher chance of being picked up and used in the end if everybody's involved in this production. Giulia mentioned the sensitivity mapping manual for the EU. That outlines a whole range of different approaches to mapping. How you map will depend on a lot of things in terms of the context, the species of concern, where the wind energy resource is, but also the data availability. And again, in a region like Europe, there's a great deal more data available on species and places of concern than in a country like Kenya. So your mapping can be a lot more sophisticated. The top right map is an example that's in the EU manual, a study which I'm sure most of you have seen or familiar with in Greece, which is essentially based on species and looking at species locations and buffers around them. Then a more recent one, which is more based on sites, looking at habitats, looking at the Natura 2000 sites and unfragmented habitat, and using that as a proxy for where you want to avoid having wind farms located. Again, the results look a little bit different in the two cases. There's lots of commonalities. You need to think carefully about what you're incorporating in your mapping and what might be left out. Other thing to stress, I guess, is that it's also important not to take an area that appears to be not sensitive as such if the data underlying that presentation aren't adequate. So in the Kenyan case, we know there are some parts of the country we just haven't got enough data to be sure, and those are better seen as kind of not determined rather than definitely safe. So even with your sensitivity mapping and strategic planning, you'll probably want to do risk screening. And it's particularly important to do it if you haven't got that other information to see what the risks might be on site. Essentially, this is a desktop exercise, sometimes informed by specialist input and by criteria that you might be wanting to follow, for example, around Performance Standard 6 in many cases for projects funded by IFC or equator banks around the world. It's a way of just making sure that you flag the risks that might be there and whether you have sensitive wildlife on site or in the surroundings of the site, because again, you wouldn't just look at a particular location, but also a buffer around it. This doesn't tell you, unless you look at multiple sites, what's happening in the wider land or seascape. It doesn't tell you a priori if there are more suitable locations elsewhere, which you can understand better from sensitivity mapping. So it's more of a site-based approach, but still very useful. And there are tools available to support this. I think Giulia might have mentioned the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment tool, which is a compilation of a range of global data sets on biodiversity, some managed by IUCN, some by other partners, which gives you some handle on what's likely to be there based on the most up-to-date information on sites and species. Risk screening can help to scope what surveys you need to do, so which species you need to focus on, either seeing whether they're there, what their status is if they're there. It's important that your survey effort matches the apparent risk. So a high-risk site, ideally you wouldn't be going there in the first place, but if you do go there, you will need to have a more intensive survey effort to make sure you understand really clearly what's happening and what the potential impacts might be. Good practice is to make sure that you survey at least across a year, ideally for longer, and across all the seasons to make sure you look at variation, presence and activity. And you also need to consider not just the site itself, but what's happening in the landscape around it. And this could be in terms of wildlife movements and also where there might be particular important sites such as wetlands or nesting sites or indeed migration routes that could be linked to the project with wide-ranging species. Your risk surveys can help you identify where you can do further avoidance, so micrositing for turbines on site, for example, to avoid places where bats are congregating or where birds are passing through, and also how your project infrastructure like transmission lines can be routed. It can help you identify what more you'll need to do to minimize impacts. And ideally, if you have different developments happening in the same landscape, you would try to coordinate your efforts so that you get a more complete picture of what's happening, a better baseline, and you can compare the results and work out how they match up in different sites. Looking at the mitigation measures themselves, unfortunately, it isn't always possible to eliminate impacts through avoidance. You may have to try to minimize them on site. The technology and the approaches for this are constantly improving, although they certainly are far from perfect yet. One measure that's been tested in recent years but proved quite effective is shutdown on demand. In other words, where you have a system to detect birds or bats at risk, and you then shut down the turbines when they become when they pass through the site and look like there might be a collision. You can make sure the turbine is not turning and reduce the risk of the birds or bats hitting it. This is essentially observer-led. It can be supported by radar systems, and there are now also more sophisticated approaches, including automatic cameras, for example, that identify particular species, work out how they're moving around the site, and if they look like they're on a collision course, automatically shut down the turbines. Those are quite expensive at the moment, and still may need support from field observers, but it's a promising line for the future. Most of shutdown on demand up till now has been seasonal, so it's particularly well suited when you have wind farms that do have migrants passing through at certain times of the year. If you can detect activity of migrants and shut down the turbines for short periods, that's quite an effective mitigation measure. But in Africa, we've also now been involved with some projects where we have continuous shutdown on demand across the entire year, especially for vultures, where the activity is year-round and unpredictable. The birds are very wide-ranging and can move through the site at any time. So at one wind farm where TBC is working, we have around 30 observers stationed around the site and working every day during daylight hours. And when a vulture is detected on a collision course, they then instruct the operator to shut the turbine down. One other useful approach that hasn't been fully tested yet may be to paint one of the turbine blades, as in the picture on the top right here. That's only been trialed in one wind farm in Norway so far, but it has been very effective in reducing mortality of an eagle species, the white-tailed eagle. It needs further testing elsewhere. It seems that the painted turbine makes it easy for the birds to see the blades moving and therefore to avoid them. But we haven't yet tested this elsewhere in the world. So I guess the message there again is that there's quite a few new approaches that do need to be trialed and evidence gathered as to how effective they are, so we can see whether they work or not in different circumstances. With bats, one of the most effective measures is often to curtail, i.e. to stop the turbines turning at low wind speeds. So you increase the speed at which the turbines cut in and start generating power and turning. That's because bats are often most active at low wind speeds. And so by doing this, you can dramatically decrease the risk to bats. There's also been development in recent years of acoustic deterrence with high frequency sound that can deter bats. Again, those have been produced only for a few species as yet. They need to be tested more widely in other parts of the world. And outside the North Temperate Zone, You have bats that don't use echolocation, the Megacoroptera or fruit bats, and we haven't yet figured out the most appropriate ways to deter them from approaching turbines. There may be methods, but they haven't yet been trialed. Overall message is that minimization can be really useful, but it tends to be quite costly. It's rarely fully effective, and therefore it's once again important to prioritize avoidance and try to avoid the need to have to minimize or reduce the amount of minimization you have to do in the first place. Offshore wind, there are similar approaches that apply, but it's also important to consider the specifics of the marine environment. I mentioned marine mammals before.
Συγγνώμη, Διονύση, σε παρακαλώ, κλείσε το μικρόφωνο σου. Διονύση.
No problem.
Sorry
with marine mammals, no, that's fine, no problem. With marine mammals, you can sometimes look at their behavior patterns and try to avoid construction when the mammals are around. So many cetacean species, for example, whales and dolphins, may migrate and visit certain sites for calving and for feeding at certain times of the year. If you can avoid those times of the year, then you can avoid impacts to those species. There are ways also reducing noise impacts by the way that you actually carry out your piling, i.e. how you drive the turbine base into the seafloor to make sure that it has a solid base. That's a very noisy operation normally. You can start that slowly and scale up so that animals have a chance to move away. You can try to keep animals away through so-called pingers and other things like bubble curtains, which are a way of reducing the sound and reducing its intensity. But noise is a particular issue in the marine realm at the construction phase, not so much during operations, fortunately. And similarly, ways to reduce the collision risk from vessels which are around during the operations and maintenance phase, by making sure that you're controlling the number and the speed where they're traveling, and also having observers on board that can make sure that you're not in danger of colliding with whales or dolphins or other marine mammals. Transmission lines are an important thing to think about too. It's not just the wind farm itself, but the way that it has to evacuate or get its electricity out to the grid. If that involves building new transmission lines, that can be a serious issue for some species of birds, which may be at collision risk, mainly from the thin earth wire, so-called, at the top, which is quite hard to see. You can see it on the right here with bird diverters on it, these spheres. And there's different kinds of diverters, some of which seem to be more effective than others in different contexts. But essentially they make that top wire more visible to the birds passing through and help them to avoid it. Nowadays, there's also illuminated diverters that flash or shine at night, which is important for some night flying birds, including migrants and things like flamingos, which tend to fly at night and potentially in certain circumstances may be at risk of hitting the power wires. Before you get to that point, it's also often possible to look at your routing and try to make sure that you avoid regular flight paths or sensitive areas like wetlands where birds may be congregating. Again, this depends on having good survey information to begin with so that you can plan your route accordingly. And it's also possible to do things like burying power lines, which is a very effective measure, but can be quite expensive. And so tends to be applied only when there's particular challenges in rerouting or otherwise avoiding birds from hitting the wires. Generally, in modern wind farms, the issues are around transmission lines. In some countries, distribution lines are also a problem. Distribution lines being the lower voltage lines that take power out to the users. If those are designed badly, then there can be a real issue with electrocution because birds or bats or other animals perch on the wires and spread their wings or move and create a current that essentially fries them. It's very easy to avoid that, but unfortunately we do still see wildlife unfriendly designs. My own country, Kenya, it's quite frustrating that despite knowing the problem and understand the problem very well, the power company is still building lines hung on concrete poles that are really, really dangerous for birds. It's very easy to prevent that. It's not any more expensive. It just has to be factored into the design before you begin. I think that's something that's well understood, fortunately, now in the European Union. I'm skipping over restoration because it's not a big issue for wind farms normally. Obviously, you do want to restore your impacts if you've been building roads or buildings or doing other things on site and clearing vegetation. The idea would be to restore that as you go along, and also make sure that that's done according to good practice approaches, so that you're restoring with the right kind of vegetation, you're conserving soils when necessary, you're not introducing invasive species. That's all approaches which are well understood for other infrastructure, and so can be applied to wind farms too. But then you come to offsets, and if you still have residual impacts after you've avoided, minimized, and restored, then you may need to turn to offsets as a last resort to try to compensate for impacts to priority biodiversity. Offsets are normally quite focused. They're not that, in general for everything. You're trying to deal with species or habitats that are of particular concern. Offsets are very appealing in principle, but they're often quite hard to manage in practice. They can be very complex to plan, hard to implement, uncertain in outcomes, and also very frequently quite expensive. But in principle, you can address your residual impacts through two approaches. Either reducing the threats to species elsewhere. So for example, if you have a raptor species that is being affected by electrocutions on badly designed distribution lines, one offset approach would be to try to retrofit those lines so that the electrocutions don't happen anymore, and therefore you can save birds from electrocution outside your site and compensate for any impacts you may be having on the site. Similarly, you could restore or remediate damage to habitats or species elsewhere. There's an example on the right here from South Africa. That's the black harrier in the top picture, a really lovely endemic and threatened harrier species, which is also an internal migrant to Southern Africa, and so quite vulnerable to cumulative impacts from wind farms. It has specialized habitat requirements. Its habitat is now very scarce. But one offset approach is to try to restore these little patches of so-called renosterfelt in the agricultural landscape and make them more attractive for harrier breeding and foraging, and that will improve the survival and reproductive output of the species and compensate for potential collision impacts. It may also have the useful benefit of keeping the birds out of the sites because they're more likely to forage where the habitat is good than in the site where ideally the habitat initially wasn't good to start with. And important to note that Giulia has already flagged that very often, because wind developments do cover a large area, although the footprint itself in terms of the actual base of the turbines is quite small, you may be looking after or protecting a substantial area of land, either having leased it from landowners or bought it or managing it with their consent. That can often provide opportunities if you're putting your farm in a degraded or fragmented landscape to do proactive conservation actions on site, restore habitat, restore flower meadows, restore habitat for pollinators, for other wildlife. You want to make sure you aren't introducing new problems by attracting species in that might collide with the turbines, of course, but there can be some really good opportunities for improving biodiversity in a proactive way. Important to note the issue of post-construction monitoring. So it's really important to track your impacts and your mitigation after you've built your site, as well as before. And this has to be done in a robust and standardized way that really needs to include monitoring of collision fatalities. And there's some quite technical issues around this in terms of how you decide what your fatalities are. You need to have trials to estimate how well you're detecting fatalities, because you don't always find birds or bats that have been killed, especially small ones. You need to look at how your carcasses fatalities are persisting in the environment, because they could disappear, they've been taken by scavengers or just rot away. And ideally, you'll be using protocols that allow the use of estimation software. There's some well-established programs now like GenEst and something called Evidence of Absence, which are becoming the industry standards. And I guess the recommendation from our guidelines is that every wind farm should be collecting data that will feed into these programs in a clear and straightforward way. And also, if possible, sharing the data transparently, because that improves the information-based future planning, especially for parts of the world where our information is limited. That will really help us to understand what's happening and to plan better in future. and make sure that we can reduce impacts even more effectively in future years. And then I think almost finally, just to note that there are also issues around the impacts of the end of life of wind farms. That may involve repowering, where you either reconstruct or renew the turbines to keep the wind farm going after their active life is over, or decommissioning. You can do further mitigation at this point. Sometimes you can also take further action. So if you have problem areas in your wind farm where lots of collisions have been taking place, you can move your turbines away from those. Ideally, if you're decommissioning, you'll bring the site back to at least as good a situation as it was before, and ideally better, to revegetation, reinstatement of original vegetation, obviously managing waste. And in some cases, maybe unusual on land, but certainly in the sea, it can be that you can actually have biodiversity benefits from the infrastructure. So the turbine bases may be quite an important macrohabitat for certain aquatic species that can even support improvements in fisheries, for example. And you want to have understood what's going on, and if it's appropriate, keep those intact to maintain those benefits. That's all from me. I'm very happy to take questions by email after this session, and of course to take questions along with Giulia at this point. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Leon. I think the two presentations, one after the other, made very much not only sense, but they provide a lot of information. You touched upon some of the points that we have already mentioned, but before I open the discussion, there's 2 or 3 things that I wanted to add on what we heard from you. The first one is that I want to very much thank you, because besides providing all the knowledge, I think you're helping us understand and see the situation in Greece into the broader perspective, so that we're not alone in facing the issues that we're facing in Greece, and things seem to be quite similar in many parts of the world. Greece is obviously one very important case study, because it is doubly important, being host for a very high biodiversity because of its geographical positioning, but also being a very important country for the development of renewable energy because of both wind and solar potential that it has. So, you know, the conflict comes at a higher rank, if you like. The second thing is that I'm very happy that we got to follow your presentation with the members of our discussion, because I think it is important that both sides are getting together on the scientific knowledge that is shared with us. And in fact, I forgot to say before that the publication for this study and showing parts that Giulia presented, we will do it, but of course, all the members of this discussion group will be invited to participate as members of the publication group for this thing, because we want to have as much ownership as possible by everyone for such a study that sets down the scientific knowledge and becomes like a basis for discussion. On our own hand, we are now working on the level of developing some policy recommendations. So what you presented to us will definitely be very helpful in enriching what we'll be doing. And the following discussions that we'll have will be specifically focused on licensing and spatial planning, which the state is currently developing. So I think the contribution that we hear from you is very, very, very interesting. And finally, my own view is that you're helping us very much see that the need to protect biodiversity while developing renewable energy sources is not an externality. It's a thing that has to become part of both the legislation, the regulation, and if need be, also of the cost. Because if we fear that this will increase the cost, then we just accept the fact that then biodiversity is just an externality, and that is not correct. Because to my view, these are equally important things. With that said, I would like first to open the floor for the members of our group, the discussion group, if they want to take the floor for a question or a comment. So if members of the group, you want to say something, please either raise your hand or your electronic hand in Zoom. Or otherwise, if we don't have that, we have a question by Ms. Vasiliki Kati. Actually, you did mention her study, Leon, in your presentation at one point. And Ms. Professor Kati, sorry, is saying, we thank the organizers for this very interesting webinar. I would love to hear the presenter's opinion on the question, is climate crisis or biodiversity crisis the most important threat to human society? So is anyone who wants to take this question?
Do you want to give an IUCN perspective, Giulia, first?
Yeah, so no, it's not. This is really the conversation we had with the group when we tried to come up with a share forward, which you think, okay, it's a page, but let me tell you, to get 8 organizations to sign the same one page, it's quite a challenge. The result is really, they feed into each other. So it's not about either or, they really feed into each other. We all know about how, biodiversity is affected by climate change, but also how nature can support, mitigation of climate change and adaptation to climate change. So loss of biodiversity will definitely have a bigger impact on the effects on climate change, and climate change has an effect on biodiversity. It's not about either or, it's really about learning how to work at the systemic way. And I think this is at every level, in a team, in an organization, in a country, working at the system level is a huge challenge, and we know why. But I think now is this complex issues from the environmental perspective really put us at, is a challenge that we have to embrace and learn to work on a systemic way. So it's not about either or, but it's really about finding the right mix between the two. We want renewable, and that's what we keep saying. We need, and the world also, the other aspect is not just climate change and biodiversity. There are a lot of social needs that we have, access to energy, that we can't say, no, from now we have to, we can't have energy. I mean, there are some population that really need, that still is a basic need. So it's how do you deliver that in a way that doesn't cost the earth, on the same side, limiting the climate change. And I know it might sound like a political answer, but I think that the solution is often by working at the system level and bringing different people together.
Thank you, Giulia. Leon, you want to add something to this, or?
Thank you. I think Giulia has said it really, really well. The two issues are inextricably linked. By recognizing the links, we can address each of them more effectively. I think possibly the underlying or implication, and something that we sometimes hear, one reason for producing the guidelines, is that the climate crisis is so urgent that we have to do everything we can to address it, whatever that means for biodiversity, including expanding renewable energy. And the clear message from our guidelines and from all the research that's been done on this topic is that we can upscale renewable energy enormously to the scale that we need to address climate without impacting biodiversity negatively. That is possible to do.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, both of you. We have one more question on the Q&A, as I don't see any of the participants in the group lifting up their hand. So the question is by Mr. Ioannis Lainas, and the question is, in the examples you have studied during the strategic assessment for the suitable areas, what are the basic measurement and research methods given the initial design phase? Are field researches included, and or utilization of modern technologies like satellite observation or utilization of secondary official sources, for example, existing spatial plans? That's quite technical.
Maybe I can have a go at answering that. Yeah. So I think the essential answer is that you use whatever you can find that's helpful. So there's no kind of set right answer. And therefore, again, it very much depends on where you are and what information you've got at your disposal. But certainly you would want to use satellite imagery, looking at land cover, for example, and the naturalness of vegetation and the distribution of habitats. You'd want to use information on bird movements. So with the Kenyan example, a really key data set was the movements of satellite tagged vultures. So if you look at a range map for a vulture, it's everywhere, and that's not very helpful in telling you where you shouldn't put your wind farm. But if you use satellite tags, you can get a much better idea of where the birds are actually spending most of their time and where the risks might be greatest. Ideally, you'll be doing more of that kind of data collection, including fieldwork to fill in gaps. And again, in Kenya, we did do some fieldwork, for example, to look at data gaps for vulture colonies and for bat roosts in little flooded parts of the country. That can be quite an expensive and slow business. So it will depend on your resources and your timetable. The overall message from me, I guess, will be that even in quite data poor situations, which I don't think is the case for Greece, you can make a lot of headway with the information that you have, so long as you're transparent and clear about what you can and can't conclude from it, so where the data gaps still exist.
Yeah.
It's much better to have an imperfect picture based on the data that you have available than just to have nothing available to plan from.
Yeah.
Yes, Giulia, you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to stress one point that Leon made at the beginning, saying if you don't have the data on that place, and it doesn't mean that, you know, the decisions on that place doesn't mean that there is no risk. It actually needs a different category. And if you adopt, you know, a precautionary principle, that's the time to adopt that principle. To say if, you know, certain areas you're missing data, then you should maybe even have more precaution, because you know, that's. Yeah. Or try to identify, you know, find a different way to get more data about that area.
I'd like to add on this, mostly for your information, Giulia and Leon, that one of the first discussions we had as a group was about data, actually, and we did discuss very much how important it is to have data, yes, both before and during construction, but also during the operation phase, because that, yes, can give us a lot of knowledge. And the second point that we mentioned in our findings, which will be part of our recommendations, is that data, and I think Leon spoke on that, data needs to be available to all and open, so that we can also control the quality, and, you know, that, yeah, creates a very important basis. So on this, we can take the right decisions. And I'm very happy to hear that you're echoing exactly the same line, yeah, that we were following in our discussion. More questions coming in. So you see, I told you would be attracting a lot of attention. So we have a question by Mr. Haris Palioyannis. I would really like to thank the organizers and the presenters for this webinar. My question is, isn't it a very state-specific issue in general? The Mediterranean is a biodiversity, tourism, climate change, and pollution hotspot with great potential for renewable energy. Aren't the challenges more aggregated and a need for a specific approach than, for example, Northern European countries?
Well, my point is that it's not about a specific approach, is that the solutions will have to be specific. I mean, our guidelines speak about a general framework and a series of important actions that need to be taken by different stakeholders, policy, and especially project developers at the utility level. But the answer, what they adopt, it really depends on the specific situation. And the point of going in an area which already has multiple uses, this is certainly a key issue. And this is my point about the importance of doing cumulative assessments. And the key player of that at the end of the day is the, you know, government. And they, you know, and that is part of the assessment, is looking at how to use your land use, but also looking at the interaction between the existing and future users, how they interact. Some of these uses create, you know, are antagonistic, and some of them kind of offset each other. So there is a lot, I mean, which is not my area, but there is a lot said about cumulative effects assessment, a lot of good, you know, examples. And certainly in the areas that are so busy and impacted like the Mediterranean, I would say a cumulative assessment is, I would say, certainly a must. That would be my suggestion. So, and that's why I said the guidelines are a general framework. They do not give a specific answer to that. We say that this answer has to be adopted everywhere at all. That's not our message.
Thank you. Thank you. Then I'm moving on to the next question. It's by Ms. Clary Papazoglou. And Clary says, correct strategic planning and strategic environmental assessment are crucial. What do you say for a situation where licensing applications and permits are moving ahead while strategic planning and strategic environmental assessment is lagging behind? Is a moratorium advised, and how do you take into account land ownership issues, which often restrict available alternatives? That's 5 questions in one, but all of them interesting.
Yes, very charged questions. Let me answer to the moratorium one. That's what I was saying in the way we have addressed this issue is to try in our guidelines to be as, match the ideal situation and then also providing some realistic solutions. So the ideal situation is where you have a land use plan supported by a strategic environmental assessment that defines the values, biodiversity values, best areas for development, and then you have developers that do their own site assessments, risk assessment, and then mitigation plan. We say that's where, ideally you as a developer should go to these areas because these are the safest ones from also an operational, development in let's say investment, because you're likely to have very little pushback and, things have been identified, risks have been identified for you. But we also say situations where this is not available, there is also this idea of that the developer itself, in partnership with the experts, can compensate partially with this sensitivity mapping. So to get a context, it is not a policy tool, but it's still a tool that allow the users to see at the landscape level what are the priorities, what are the most important values of biodiversity, and how these are impacted specifically by, in this case, being renewable, solar or wind and so on. So this is the recommendation we make in the guidelines, saying, you want to go ahead, then still find information, and that was decision-making tree that I showed. Still find this information, and there are partners out there that you can work with and try to map out at the landscape or the seascape level what are the key values.
Thank you, Giulia. That's very, very interesting and very helpful, because I think that Clary's question is very much to the point, as some of the tools are being under development. So we currently, as I said before, have at the national level the development of the specialized spatial planning tool for renewable energy. And so this is a very open debate. At the same time, one thing that I want to add to the question more rather than the answer, and your answer serves to some extent that purpose as well, is that very often, and I think that is very much the case in our country as well, the actual potential of the services, the public services that are involved in the licensing themselves, are not strong enough to respond to the avalanche, I would say, of the request for new licenses. The demand is totally crazy in some cases, and the people who are working in those services, who are humans, they have limits. They cannot respond in a very proper way to everything. So things are lagging behind, and there's a pressure for things to move faster. So what you just explained, I think, provides an approach for addressing such things without the polarization that doesn't serve much in its sense.
And exactly, the moratorium has a very strong meaning. So, and that's what I was saying, it's not, that's not what we recommend. However, what you're describing is a situation where somebody has to say, okay, hold on a second, we need to get our house in order to actually be able to move forward. Also to have an idea, what is the, what is the energy plan that you have in mind, everybody's coming, and then what are you going to do with, is this, how much do you want, how much energy is needed, how much renewable energy, what is the distribution network, is the distribution network in place? This is also another conversation to have about, identifying go areas where they are suitable because of low biodiversity, for example, and high resource being wind and sun. But then also you have to make sure that there is the network available, and then you don't then have a problem because you have to create a new network. So it's complex, you're right. And then sometimes the permitting, the licensing units, they end up having, not being ready, not having done all this homework in advance. And this is probably how, processes like yours also can help them catch up a little bit faster in getting to the right, level of knowledge and policy maturity.
Exactly, and that's why we're doing it, because we think that it is very much a matter of good governance. You know, you have to involve the stakeholders and then try to have the answers. I had promised to both of you. Ioli Christopoulou from the Green Tank wants to take the floor. Ioli, please.
Yes, hello. Thank you to both of you. I hope you can hear me despite the mask. I have actually two questions, and I think one goes for each one of you. One is whether you could tell us, maybe Giulia, you could relate if there was a progress as you were developing the guidelines in the shifts of positions among the stakeholders. So maybe you could tell us whether they came in more extreme positions and you were able to find some common ground or not, because I think that's something that would be useful to hear, to see that there is potential for a win-win option here. And then the second question, which I think may be more towards Leon, is in relation to your comment that the guidelines, of course, cover the globe and are also very much targeting developing countries to an extent. I understand what you are saying, but I was wondering whether you have tested it with the EU policies. And I understand from the reference list that you have already taken into account the guidelines for the Natura 2000 sites that the European Commission has issued. So I was wondering whether there was some dialogue with the European Commission on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ioli. So the first question is, so we were lucky that we started this process pre-COVID. And so we actually had the opportunity of having a first face-to-face 5 days meeting, and it was extremely successful, because people left the 5 days with a sense of achievement that they had learned something and they had understood a different perspective. And I think this applied to all. You know, we had a representative from the 4 NGOs, we had representative from the 3 companies, we had IUCN representative from IUCN Commission members and couple national committees of IUCN. What was interesting is that I've been in a lot of the stakeholder discussions where the beginning is really the hardest one. Everybody's kind of like, you know, we hate you and we don't want this. But in this case was actually very different. Everybody came to the table saying, we are here because we all believe that we need more renewable energy, because that's what we need. Our world needs this energy that has low impact, but still has an impact. And therefore we are here to understand how to address better this impact. The change, I think, was very much about listening to each other challenges and understanding why certain things cannot be done. You know, little things such as somebody mentioned, but why can't we just use everybody's roof to do this? You know, like instead of using new land, you know, there is so many roofs and parking lots and this. And the companies were, well, don't you think we have tried? I mean, there's challenges. And of course, you might think, okay, this is an excuse, but trying not to be, you know, without being cynical, people really started to listen, saying, okay, this is a credible reason why certain things look nice in theory, but actually in practice are not that simple. So then the question is, okay, so then how do we resolve this? You know, can we find some solutions? And I think everybody was there with this solution-driven mind. So we are here to find a common solutions, because what we find as a solution will go into these guidelines. So I think that's the spirit that we did. So I think everybody left with different knowledge, you know, more knowledge about, or a different view on what they thought was a right thing. And then they kind of saw different perspectives. So that was really, really helpful. We had invested a lot in this meeting, really a lot in terms of preparation. And I am so grateful. I work with people like Leon and his team that have the same spirit, preparation, and also an amazing facilitator who also prepared a lot. So, and then we were in the same room. That helped. The second meeting was through a video. It was one of the first Zooms, actually. We canceled even before people that was mandatory to cancel meetings, but we didn't want to take any risk because we had people coming from all over. So we did it. It was one of the first Zoom workshops we did with separate rooms and things. So we tested also that. But because people knew each other, it actually ended up to be a very constructive meeting. But yeah, it's a challenge, but I think it's, the solution is working at the system level, and the system is about bringing together different people, different sectors together. So yes, you have a great challenge, but also an opportunity with the project.
Thank you, Giulia.
And on the EU question, I think the EU is generally far advanced in most parts of the world in terms of the regulation and the guidance on this already. So we draw more on EU approaches and documents as an example and a source of good practice for elsewhere. Not that I'm sure the EU approaches can't be improved as well, but we were mainly looking to how we could encourage good practice in areas where at the moment the regulation might be quite weak and the practices might be quite shaky. We had a lot of people reviewing the document as well as at the stakeholder meetings, including some wind industry forums in Europe. I'm not sure whether we actually engaged the EU Commission. I suspect that we didn't, but Giulia can correct me. You can't hear you, Giulia?
We did, but I forgot her name. It's in the acknowledgement as well.
So there has been some engagement, but we weren't trying to align the guidance with the EU approaches specifically, but to draw on them as an example of existing good practice.
Thank you very much, both of you. I know I had promised to you that this would last less than 1.5 hours, and we're just on the limit of the 1 hour and 30 minutes. But we do have 2 more questions, and I would hate to have the people that ask the questions miss the opportunity to hear from you directly. So if you want to bear with us for another 5 minutes to answer those 2 questions, and then we will close the meeting. We cannot take any more questions, but let me just put them out there, both of the questions for you. The first one is by Mr. Dimitris Gotsis. Mr. Gotsis says, thank you for the great presentations. If a country has a very poor quality and outdated renewable energy system spatial planning, does not study cumulative impact of projects, and has not yet defined conservation objectives, shouldn't they be following the proactive protection directive you presented and only place wind farms outside of environmentally sensitive areas? And the second question is, as far as Greece is concerned, all the guidelines discussed in this webinar are going to taken into consideration for the site-specific management plans for Greek Natura areas that are currently under development by various environmental consultancy offices? Well, I guess the second question is not something that you would know very much to answer. First one, you have touched on it quite a lot. It describes a pretty grim picture. I'm not sure I agree with such a grim picture, but still, hearing your answer would be interesting.
Yes, the question is data. As you said, data is a must. I mean, if I were a financial institution and I want to invest in a company and I have no information on this company, on its performance, I would not put my money in there. That would be my answer.
Yeah.
I think we need to work. We have to start thinking about environment in the same way. We don't have information, therefore we should really be careful about what we do, because certain type of impacts are, there is no return. There is very difficult to restore certain type of habitats. Also, these type of investments are there to last in the long term. That's what we want. So I think it's worth investing first in getting better data and better spatial data and collecting, information locally in order to have a better understanding of what could be the sensitivities and the opportunities. Because again, we are talking about a lot of risk, which is important, and we all, we have. And I think I'm the risk manager in my team, because I embrace risk. For me, knowing risk is the best way to be safe later on. So it's not something negative, but also there are also opportunities. Let's not forget the opportunity for restoration, opportunities to have a better investment in the long term. So again, data are not there, then invest in getting the data, invest in getting information on spatial and biodiversity values.
Thank you, Giulia. Leon, you want to add something?
Yeah, just a little, I think. So I guess the general point that obviously the guidelines outline, the ideal approach. We recognize that in the real world, things are messy and complicated. There often are information gaps, policy failures, competing interests. It's not so easy to make things work. But the guidelines provide a framework for kind of doing the best that you can. This ties back to Clary's question as well, I think. So yes, I think in principle, if the information base is poor, you should be very precautionary and seek to strengthen the information base and make sure that where you're putting things, you aren't likely to do serious harm. There's a point that Clary had asked, which might be relevant to this too, which we see in some countries around the world, to do with land ownership and land rights. So sometimes the areas which are less vulnerable for biodiversity are privately owned or require resettlement, have other social issues, maybe are more expensive to build in. Sometimes governments are keen to give out areas of natural habitat or being protected areas because, in a sense, the land is free.
Yeah.
That, I think, from our perspective, is a policy failure.
Yeah.
That should not be happening. So just because the land is publicly owned doesn't mean it should be accessible to any kind of development. You have to try and balance things more clearly than that.
Yeah. So, I mean, to complete what Leon said, at the end of the day is really, especially in this sector, is so much about governance and good governance, especially when you have multiple small investors. You really need to have that kind of role of bringing the different actors together for the planning side, for the, the identifying areas and finding, for example, incentives for landowners to use their land, especially if their land is the best because it's low biodiversity. There is one more point. There is the issue about procurement of materials and circular economy, which of course at the beginning of the cycle is not an issue because you're investing, but down the line, a certain point, some of this infrastructure will become old and will have to be recycled. So that's another important role to have centralized, because otherwise you're going to have a waste issue down the line that is going to be huge. So a point to consider really early on, to think about what is going to be the vision in the future in terms of the circularity of the system. So from the design, including the procurement of the material, and what is going to happen to this, once decommissioned.
Thank you so much, both of you. Just one point before we close this. I tend to say things as an economist very often, and one of the things that I keep on saying is don't forget to count in the externalities, not only in the sense of the biodiversity being considered an externality, but externalities, they have this bad habit of sneaking up on you at one point. And so at one point, biodiversity might sneak up on you because we will realize how important the loss is, and then the investors will have to pay the price of having forgotten to account for this externality. But also, one thing that I was very much intrigued by what you said, Giulia, is that if you do not count the risk of having, for example, backlash, social backlash into something because you have not done the proper planning, this is an externality that will come back and haunt you. And you might be paying the price for that. So also for the investors, it's very important to have proper planning. We have now gone beyond our planned time for like 10 minutes already, and I want to thank you very much for bearing with us. I want to thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I think you contributed significantly to our discussion. And as I already answered on the chat with somebody, we will be uploading the video from this discussion on our blog, and I will send to both of you, of course, like to all our members, and to people that follow the discussion the link, so you can also check it and download it.
And we will send you the PDF of our presentation so that you can use that
which
as
we
well.
will also share in our blog, and I want to thank you very much. And of course, we'll be in discussion about the actual publication and how we'll translate all this to Greek, because I think many people will be able to use it even better in our own language. So with this, and on behalf of all of our discussion group, I want to thank you so much for being with us. I hope and believe that this is the first and not the last one that we'll have together. And have a very good continuation of your day and your week. Thank you so much, both to you, Giulia.
Thank you very much, Sparos, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you, and wish you all the best in your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.